So here we're focusing on our computational fluid dynamics, or CFD, aspect of evaluating how effective masks can reduce social distancing. So here CFD is basically a tool that they utilize in the aircraft industry or other aspects where we want to understand complicated fluid dynamics interactions. Here we're using it to understand transport of aerosols and droplets. So in our CFD model, we basically are evaluating the effectiveness of a mask based on an adaptation of a recent publication from Physics of Fluids. So what we have is essentially evaluating the effectiveness of dispersion, or how far droplets and aerosols transport or move from speech and coughs with and without a mask. Our mask that we're using is based on a model that is assuming a cotton-based face covering. So there's a lot of things that we could include in the context of a CFD model. Some of the key things that we're including is buoyancy from thermal effects. So as you see here, we have a body with various temperatures. It's all colored by temperatures. Your clothes is actually a lower temperature than your face, and the inner surfaces in your mouth are heated. So we're accounting for all those effects. We're also coupling those effects to various gaseous flows. So we include oxygen, vapor, carbon dioxide, and that transfer process when we breathe. We're also including, when seeding our model, with droplets that are evaporating with the surrounding environment. And we also have a mask filtering and blockage effect. And that's all based on previously peer-reviewed journal modeling formats. So what we have in our model is specifically, I would say, it's pushing the state of the art. We have a person interacting with an inflow duct and an outflow duct. They're in a relatively large room. And a key thing is the inflows on the left side of the person, on this side of the person, and the outflows on the other side. So we have a persistent current pulling the droplets further than they would if there wasn't a current. So it's in that sense, it's conservative estimate of what would happen in a confined space. So this is where we're really pushing the state of the art, is we are feeding our model representative flow rates for breathing, speech, and coughs at the back of the esophagus. And we have it interacting with a flow network that represents the URT, or upper respiratory tract. So we have a nasal passage and we have a mouth passage with a reasonable representation of what's going on. So using the state-of-the-art method and model and basically the most accurate representation of a human body that we could get that's relevant to here, we are assessing the effectiveness of a mask. So this is one of the key slides, and I want to hit this up front and center because it's essentially the most important one. What we're looking at is, what does social distancing mean with a concept of a mask usage? So what we have is our model positioned at 0 feet. This top one is without a mask. This bottom one is with a mask. And we have these red bars. They basically look at, and they are based on how far we observe aerosols, which actually traveled the furthest in the context of coughs. We did the same thing with speech, but we're just plotting one because it was pretty much the same answer. So when you look at 6 feet social distancing, general guidelines, 6 feet social distancing, doesn't matter if you have a mask or not. This is where we're at. And this is the case, kind of like the worst case scenario in the context of the current CDC guideline. This is a similar case when we use a mask. And what you see, and we'll see this in the videos, is this distance that the aerosols persist goes down. And what we're going to talk about this is a context of a buffer. So let me play the video, and we'll start interrogating the results. So as you look at this, you can see these black kind of surfaces that indicate the aerosols coming out. You can also see the colors, and those colors are the droplets that tend to fall. If you look at with the mask, the aerosols just barely travel because the mask is not because the mask is blocking the aerosols. The aerosols are able to pass right through, but they also block the flow that enables the aerosols to transport or to move long distances. So if we look at without the mask, if we track 5 minutes of coughing, several coughs every 5 seconds, the furthest we got was about 4.5 feet. In the context of the CDC guideline, that's 1.5 foot of buffer or extra space where perhaps you aren't, perfect, you aren't really taking into account 6 feet. You maybe move around a little bit, or there's a lot of different reasons why you might have buffer. We're taking this interpretation of the CDC guidelines because this one actually is something we could understand and make sense of. It's very hard to find any actual aerosols that travel up to 6 feet, or even an accurate basis for the 6 feet guideline. So if we take that same kind of concept to the case with the mask, again, the mask is blocking the flow. And what happens is the thermal plume from the body and the face tends to elevate the aerosols and elevate it away from the neighboring people. So when we look at this, we get about 1 foot distance traveled with a mask and almost a 5 foot buffer with the CDC guideline. You can interpret this in 2 ways. One, this is extra safe. Or 2, we have excess buffer of what really makes sense. If we compare to the WHO guideline, the WHO guideline, which is about 3 feet, gives us about 2 feet of buffer when masks are mandated. That's more than the CDC's guideline of 1.5 feet. If we look at that and consider that, we have about 3 feet of excess buffer or space we're wasting that can be utilized to have industries operate, or industries, businesses, and these sorts of things operating more efficiently and effectively. So again, when we look at CDC guidelines, we have about a 4.5 foot of distance where aerosols can transport, at least directly, or direct exposure from them, and about 1.5 foot of buffer. When we use that WHO guideline of 3 feet of social distancing and mask mandates, we have the aerosols traveling essentially, or the direct exposure to the aerosols traveling about 1 foot and 2 feet of buffer. So that's more conservative actually than what we're looking at with the CDC guidelines. I think the very first thing you start to think about when we talk about social distancing and aerosols, the very first thing that comes up is aerosols pass around masks and they will have the ability to reach very far distances. And for that, I'm going to bring into another recent peer-reviewed publication that we just published in Physics of Fluids. And we've specifically looked at classroom studies. This is a classroom where we have 9 students and a teacher all using masks. And we have modeled this in the context of an accurately represented, essentially building or ventilation system. So I'll just talk quickly about the physics. We're considering thermal buoyancy, like we said before. That's really critical to the behavior of aerosols. We're only looking at aerosols, not droplets. The fact that they're masked indicates that droplets are less important. And we're filtering this room with a very realistic ventilation system. So here you see the ventilation port. We have this cone-style supply diffuser. If you look in about 80% of the commercial buildings, this is the type of supply diffuser, or the supply that you'll see. It's very important that it mixes essentially the flow throughout the entire room. And we're also bringing it back in through this return duct and processing it through a MERV 11 filter. It's a higher end commercial grade filter that captures about 70% of the aerosols. And it does so without really degrading the flow rates. So in the context of this room, one thing I want to mention is we studied this in the context of hypothesizing that any of the students or the teacher could be sick and they could transmit it to any of the other students or teacher. So for example, if we look at this student here in the third row left seat, he or she has the ability to transmit to any of the other students or the teacher. And when we look at this in this fashion, we have the ability to study statistics of transmission rates. So here we have about 90 different transmission routes that we're able to study. So this gives us a lot of data to understand essentially airborne transmission behavior. And what we're going to do is utilize this in the context and bring this back into what it means for airborne transmission. Okay, so this is our first case we look at, and this is a heated room with base ventilation. So no ventilation going through the ductwork, it's just heaters on the base. Worst case scenario that you kind of envision. One of the key things that we have is thermal plumes drive aerosols to the ceilings. So here we see the high density regions of aerosols being emitted from all the students and the teacher, and they go straight up to the ceiling because they're getting trapped in a thermal plume forming around your body. Tells us a couple of things. High ceilings are really good. Even keeping the rooms a little bit cooler might even be good. So this is one thing that we want to focus on. So the next thing we want to focus on is estimators are actually, they actually do a good job. These are very highly detailed CFD models. We actually include how the flow interacts with the desks, the people's legs, all kinds of things. And what we're finding is that works about as well as what you would get if you plug in just bulk parameters. So number of people in the room, number HVAC flow rates, and these sorts of things. And they compute probability using something called the Wells-Riley probability. And if you have interest, we could have there's a few online estimators that could provide this. And anybody can use it just by inputting a few different arguments of what their room size is and these sorts of things. Nevertheless, we show this by something called the Wells-Riley probability. That's the probability of transmission. Here we have it from a conservative standpoint, indicating that one viral particle leads to a transmission event. We think it's much higher than that. And this is how it behaves as a function of time. A key takeaway, this is run for an hour, consistent with a college classroom time event. And you can see the exponential rise in the probability with time. So I know we talked about a bunch of different transmission routes. They're all plotted in the light gray. But if we take the mean of that, we get this black line. And what you see is it falls right on top of what we would get from that predictor type tool. A few other takeaways. The mean is a representation of what's going to happen to the bulk population, but there are some paths that are on the order of double what the mean is. On the contrary, there's a lot of paths that are even safer than that. So this is one parameter that needs to be considered. Okay, now let's pull it back to social distancing. Here is our probability after 1 hour as a function of distance. So the distance between, for example, this student and the teacher. What's that distance? And what is the probability that we observe in all these events? What we see here is all these dots indicate that probability. And what you see here is there's not really a drop off after 2 meters. When in fact you see, there's some high transmission probabilities up here, and then it picks back up because these aerosols have the ability to interact with all the other fluid dynamics. And what we actually find is that the peak transmission probability occurs at something like 4 meters or about 12 feet out. And again, this is just indicating that social distancing in the context of everybody using masks is not really helpful for this airborne transmission route. And it gives us, so when we think about masks not blocking aerosols, no, they may not. But when you think about it, you have to consider it twofold. One, using masks prevents these initial plumes that we see here from reaching neighboring students, reaching neighboring people in lines in supermarkets. That's one level, and it provides little barriers that isolate the aerosols to the vicinity of the person. And then when you focus on these airborne routes, this is a HVAC problem more than anything. Again, we want to eliminate, we want to pull all of these probabilities down is really the goal of the airborne route. Not, and it doesn't appear to be a function of distance. So when we start looking at this in the context of HVAC design, we have this case too, which is with ventilation. So we put on those diffusing ducts and run it through a MERV 11 filter and recirculate it back into the room. So a lot of HVAC designs will recirculate it back through the entire building. We're just focusing on this room and making that assumption. Okay, again, everybody here is wearing masks and the thermal plumes elevate directly to the ceiling. One thing that you see is they get caught up with the flow from the diffuser and they start recirculating more and more throughout the room. It sounds scary at first, but it's actually a really good thing because it enables the filter or open windows to start either diluting or reducing the amount of aerosols that build up into the room. Okay, so if we go back and look at the same two things. One, estimators do a good job. We still found that this worked when the HVAC system was on. Again, this is probability of transmission as a function of time. This was the base estimator. We found that just with a mild correction factor, we can match what we observe in the room. We still see a lot of variation between the transmission paths. Here we highlight the 3 worst transmission paths. One thing, as an educator, I think it's funny that it just so happened that a student, I believe it was a student, either this student or this student infecting the teacher was the highest transmission path there. It's not necessarily this just so happened in this case, and it's not going to be a standard by any means. But from my perspective, I was the most dangerous person or most in danger in the room. Nevertheless, okay, we look at Wells-Riley probability as a function of distance with ventilation, and again, we see scatter around a curve that doesn't really drop off with distance. Again, this is not unexpected. We're just showing that this is definitely the case. It's not, social distancing doesn't really have a strong effect for airborne, essentially pathogen transmission. Okay, now let's take one more stab at this and look at what we saw with respect to the statistics of the different transmission routes. So here we have a number of transmission routes. Remember, we have about 90 total versus Wells-Riley probability. So the more to the left you are, the better. So the red ones indicate cases with ventilation, and the gray bars indicate the probabilities and number of probabilities without ventilation. So with ventilation, we pulled this curve down by we have about half the transmission probability as compared to non-ventilation. So again, we were saying social distancing, if we come back up here, or if we went to the other plot, the reduction in transmission probability was very minimal, even going all the way out to 15 and 20 feet. It might have been on average 20% less. Here we're showing 50% reduction just by turning on a ventilation system and ensuring that a standard filter was actually being utilized. So this is, I guess this is a key takeaway, this is where the second tier of how you handle probability reduction. Okay, when we think about social distancing and masks, what we found is that masks are effective at reducing them, mostly by blocking air that takes aerosols and droplets distances that demand social distancing. They basically block the air, preventing them from passing to your neighbor. There's a filtering effect of droplets, but that doesn't really relate to social distancing. It's blocking the air. So that tells us that even though a gator mask doesn't necessarily block all the droplets, it still blocks the air, preventing it from hitting your neighbor. Okay, next thing. When we looked at a cloth mask with our models, we found that it was actually safer with 3 feet of social distancing in a cloth mask as compared to no mask and 6 feet of social distancing. And we tried to close this gap by evaluating aerosol transmission routes. And we showed that HVAC, and as long as you're wearing masks, you've basically eliminated the need for long social or high or essentially social distancing at 6 feet, and you need to start focusing on HVAC as well. That's basically the key driver there. And if you are looking at social distancing, it is not the right approach because it does not reduce aerosol buildup within a classroom or an indoor setting.